All right, thank you so much. Welcome to another episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. My name is Fred Diamond. Of course, I'm the author of Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. If you're listening to today's show on Apple Podcasts, thank you so much. Please feel free to go up and give us a 5-star rating. We would greatly appreciate it. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you. Give us a thumbs up as well. Give us a comment. The book, Laura, is available on Amazon. I also give out the PDF of Love, Hope, Lyme for free. I've given out close to 1,500 copies. If you're a chronic Lyme survivor, I'd be happy to send the PDF for you. And I'm very excited today. We have Laura MacNeill, and she's the CEO of the Global Lyme Alliance, which is one of the most important organizations in the tick-borne illness and Lyme disease world. And if you recognize Laura, you've probably recognized her because GLA, again, is such an important organization. But Laura was a guest previously on the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. And Laura, we had so much response to your show and so much response to the topics that I said, we need to have you on more because GLA really is on the leading edge. And I hate to say the bleeding edge of those topics: diagnostics, research, mental health awareness, mentorship, supporting people with Lyme disease. You also have a big event in the fall. Last year, you had the actor Christopher Maloney, who was one of your ambassadors, who's still doing a great job. I saw last week he was on Capitol Hill. I'm living in Northern Virginia. I saw he and Lindsay Keys, the co-director of the Quiet Epidemic, were on Capitol Hill trying to spread the education, get more funding. So again, I'm excited to have Laura MacNeill on the show. You could go back to Apple Podcasts and find our episode, or go up on YouTube and find our first episode. And we're going to be bringing her back quarterly to talk about some important topics. Laura, it's great to see you. I'm following, obviously, everything you're doing. By the way, for our listeners, we just found out that we're both from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So if we shift our conversation into Philly speak, as I feel myself doing, that's exactly why. So Laura, give us a brief introduction into you again, and tell us a little about the GLA. And one of the topics we're going to really focus on today is co-infections. And for people who read my book, Love, Hope, Lyme, I didn't even know there were co-infections. And co-infections basically, again, is another disease that's transmitted by a tick. It's not just Lyme, bacteria, Burgdorferi. There's also other co-infections, and we're going to talk deeply about them. And some of the research that GLA is doing is so critical into understanding these co-infections, comorbidities, if you will, and how they affect Lyme survivors. So I'm excited to talk about that. Introduce yourself, tell us about GLA, and let's get started.
Yeah, that's really important. Thanks for having me, Fred. And I think that I see that the great interest in our first podcast was there's just such great thirst and hunger for a better understanding of what's happening with tick-borne infection and how to prevent this from your family, or what to do if you're caught in the storm that happens after a complicated infection from a tick bite. So I'm really glad that we have this collaboration to be able to work together, and that we can continue to bring some viable information forward. So as you said, I'm Laura MacNeill. I'm the CEO of Global Lyme Alliance. GLA was born out of the need for greater research and understanding into tick-borne disease. So it has a beautiful origin story of mothers getting together around a coffee table to do something because their kids were sick and nothing was getting done. We are multiple organizations that have been merged together over time with different focuses. So an organization that was really focused on patient advocacy and education, an organization focused on patient services, and an organization focused on research. So now our mission is that three-prong focus going forward. We do all three. But most importantly, we fund viable, innovative research that is not getting funded today in any other way. And we are encouraging the scientific community to pay attention to this and to bring forward the resources that we need. Part of the work that was being done on the Capitol Hill last week with Chris and Lindsay was taking the Quiet Epidemic documentary and creating a congressional impact statement from that, going down to Congress and taking real action to turn that documentary into real change. And so There'll be more coming out in the coming weeks about that to have a better understanding about what's next. Allie Hilfiger did attend the second day sessions too. They had 2 days of meetings. So I just want to let you guys know there's gonna be more coming out. We'll be talking about our channels, the Quiet Epidemic, we'll be talking about it too. But Fred, I'm really glad you started with a vulnerable statement that you didn't understand about co-infections, because I'm new to the tick-borne community. I started in this community as CEO of GLA. So my background is in nonprofit leadership. And I didn't know anything about co-infections either. I thought tick bite, Lyme disease, bullseye rash, antibiotics, and that's all I knew. And that's all a lot of people know, except probably the people listening to this podcast who are saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot more to the story. So I wanted to start with a quick example that happened to me since I've been CEO of GLA. My nephew, he's about 6 or 7, lives in Massachusetts. They found an engorged tick on him about a year ago. And my sister-in-law called me. I found this tick in his hair. I said, great, put it in the freezer. They pulled it out and save it. She's like, put it in my freezer. I said, yes, don't destroy it. So my big message to your community, they don't already know, don't destroy it, okay? It's a lot of information and a whole blueprint inside that tick. If you can find it and you can keep it, which is a lot of ifs, right? So she put it in the freezer and I said, now, anywhere between now and 6 weeks from now, just look for symptoms. Just look for headaches, pain, inflammation, fatigue, malaise, body aches, fever, anything. You should see that from the lens of tick-borne illness, right? And pay attention. So 3 days later, she called me. I was down at a conference at Johns Hopkins University for tick-borne illness. And she called me and she said, he has a high fever and GI issues. I said, you got to assume that's tick-borne illness. Now take that tick, send it to Tick Report, which is a lab that's in UMass Amherst. They do fabulous work. We really support them and partner with them. It's $30 to $50 for DNA testing on the tick, depending on how deep you want to go. But what they can do is say exactly what was in the belly of the tick that you found on you. And that's really important. We're going to talk about why. We don't know exactly what was in there, right? So she sent the tick away, still not believing it's anything, feeling like she's overreacting. So she gets the results back 24 to 48 hours. What was in that tick was not Borrelia burgdorferi, did not have Lyme disease. It had anaplasmosis. We're like, okay, what is this? The symptoms for anaplasmosis, Fred, recurring high fever, GI issues, no bullseye rash. So she's looking for a bullseye rash. She's fighting the urge to get him on antibiotics till she sees that bullseye rash, and it would have never happened. And I'm telling you, as a mother of elementary age children myself, recurring, like a fever that keeps coming back and GI issues, I would have written that off as a bug going through my house or through the school for months and months before I would have even ever thought that was from a tick, particularly without seeing that bullseye rash. So it's really scary, right? And that was a deep understanding and appreciation for me. So a close to home story, but we're very lucky. He got on antibiotics right away, and that's exactly what needs to happen. But they found the tick, and that's a big hurdle. No, most people don't.
Yeah, that's an incredible story. I like the way you said in the very beginning was you were getting educated on this. Okay, tick, Lyme disease, antibiotics, bullseye rash. And even in places, you're up in Massachusetts, even in places like where people think, and of course, as we know, Lyme disease is a global epidemic. There's Lyme disease every state. I've interviewed a bunch of people from Southern California. Your honoree last year at the GLA,
Kenzie,
Kenzie is from Southern California. I did a show recently with a woman talking about returning to nature. She's from San Diego. And even in places like Massachusetts, New England, all through New England, Connecticut, North Carolina, Florida, people still don't understand the breadth of this particular disease. And I guarantee you, almost nobody has heard of the co-infection that you just talked about.
No.
And yet, unfortunately, this your 6-year-old nephew got it fortuitously. They're related to the CEO of the GLA who knew, but unfortunately, as we know, you go to urgent care or you go to your GP or your family doctor, and they may say the same thing. Something's going around, or, let's check with the school and see if other kids are sick, or maybe the kid's like getting heat exhaustion, or who knows, whatever it might be. And it all goes back to a tick.
Yeah, it's going to get written off pretty easily. So knowing what was in your tick is going to give you the empowerment to be a real advocate for healthcare for you and for your family, whoever has it. And again, my community says loud and clear, it's not the tick you find, it's the tick you don't find that you really need to be concerned about. But at this point, I want to talk about today is what else do I need to be paying attention to that might not be in the mainstream media that we're talking about all of the time? Even at GLA, we're a Global Lyme Alliance, but we are funding research for all these co-infections. So quick high list, just to hear them once at least, and we're going to dive into just the two most common. We talked about anaplasmosis. In recent years, I've heard in the news, at least up here in the Northeast, about Powassan virus. You might have heard about Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is also can come from a tick bite. What I never heard of until I got into the community was auriculosis or tularemia, which is another bacterial strain. And then, of course, the two I really want to focus on are Bartonella and Babesiosis. So have you heard about those two before?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Bartonella is prevalent. As a matter of fact, I actually also interviewed Dr. Neil Nathan for the Love Hope Lyme podcast, and he has a new book that just came out where he goes into detail and the effects that Bartonella can have on sensitive patients. And those are typically people with the chronic illnesses that we're talking about today.
Yeah, definitely. So Bartonella, Babesiosis are like the two poster children of the co-infections that can come with Borrelia burgdorferi, as you mentioned, which causes Lyme disease. Like the three Bs, they're all Bs, of course, B names. But Babesiosis, let's start there. This is a tick-borne infection, and it's actually caused by a parasite. So it's not a bacteria, it's a parasite that can come from a tick bite. The parasite's called Babesia. And this infection, this parasite, what it does is it destroys your red blood cells. So this leads to symptoms such as air hunger, which I hadn't really known that symptom before either, but this is this deep need to take a big breath all the time. You can have lightheadedness, feel really weak. Some other common symptoms are a high fever, night sweats, headaches, chills, and maybe even hypoglycemia. So you're really, really sick if you've been infected with Babesia, especially in the later stage of that parasite infection. So what we do for treatment here is they use antimicrobial drugs, which are often administered in conjunction with some homeopathic remedies. So these current treatments, though, they have some severe side effects. So there's a risk of drug resistance that can be developed, and they may or may not completely eradicate the full parasite. So we really need to do some more innovative research and understanding to get better treatments for folks that are infected with Babesia. At Global Lyme Alliance, we fund a researcher. His name is Shukri Ben-Mamoon. So Dr. Shukri Ben-Mamoon, he's at Yale. Brilliant, wonderful guy. And he is focusing on Babesia, which is fabulous, right? It's exactly what we need. And GLA funded research for him, which uncovered some really promising treatment approach to this parasite infection. And it's a dual therapy approach. So what his study highlighted that if you put two different drugs together, these antimalarials, tafenoquine and atovaquone, to treat babesiosis, in mice, this combination of these two antimalarial drugs, they have the potential for not only a complete cure, but they actually show immune protection against reinfection of the Babesia parasite. So he's been able to show that in mice, but then outside of a human host, just in the lab, he's been able to show that this combination effectively kills 3 diverse Babesia species. It's very, very exciting. Now, this is very promising. It doesn't work for everybody. We understand that folks that have this particular genetic disorder, it's called G6PD, which is a genetic disorder that affects your red blood cells. They're not going to have a great response to this therapy, but we need more research and more resources around this work so that we can further the research into clinical trials and continue to re-solidify these amazing results he's had in mice.
Yeah. No, it's great to see that the GLA is connecting. I mean, there's, the Cohen Foundation, which of course, has done the LymeX studies, if you will, and the funding. And I know you've done a lot of work with some of those organizations. It's great to see the work that GLA is doing with various, researchers who are motivated to find, these solutions for these diseases that so many people are struggling with.
Yeah, and that's what it takes, right? You have to have the resources there for folks to even begin setting up a lab and setting aside a couple of years of their professional life to look at this. So Cohen Foundation and us, we're here providing those resources so that they can choose Lyme disease. They can choose Babesia work, which is really, really important. And for GLA, that only happens through generous donors. We're fully funded by the generosity of individual, corporate, and family foundations. So every gift that's given, if you're just given on the website, you're helping us be able to say yes to projects like Shukri's, which is making a huge difference. It takes a lot more resources from what he just found. We're going, whoa, that's it, right? That's it. So many people are sick right now and they can't quite clear it with the current treatment. Let's get this to market. But we're talking tens to 20s of millions of dollars to be able to get it from what we know now to get it to a clinical practice where you walk into your MD's office and they say, here's your combination therapy. You're going to be just fine. And so we continue to push forward our mission so that we can get these drug therapies to the doctor's office with great understanding. So you don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah, one thing you just touched on, again, we're talking today with Laura MacNeill. She's the CEO of the Global Lyme Alliance. One of the things you just talked on is in certain cases, there's genetics that come into play here.
Yeah.
And that's one of the further complications of this disease. It's, it's not, we use the example of if you break an ankle, every orthopedic surgeon on the planet is going to take some x-rays, put you in a walking boot or a cast, put you on your butt for 6 weeks and then go through some rehab. It doesn't matter if you're in Sydney or Shanghai or wherever it might be. With Lyme, you have all these unfortunate complications like genetics. Again, we're talking about comorbidities. We're talking about multiple infections. I remember I was talking to one of the premier Lyme literate medical doctors when I was writing my book, Love, Hope, Lyme. And he said, the biggest challenge, he goes, we know how to handle Lyme. He said, we could figure out if it was just Lyme, right? The problem is, like we're talking today, there's upwards of, how many would you estimate? Like 2 dozen to 3 dozen co-infections?
I think we know, I think there's about a dozen that we're aware of that could come from, you can get multiple from one bite, or if the chances are that a tick found you, a couple of his brothers and sisters probably found you too. And so you might get several bites, you might find one tick or not find any of them. But, I've heard stories from people who have encountered tick nests and they find hundreds on them at once. Not something that's going to call to your attention, but I'm sorry to give the visual, but it is scary, but you need to be aware that these co-infections are not going to all have a bullseye rash. They're not going to look different. And it's going to be a very complex treatment process for you to go back to health if you have multiple things happening at once.
Yeah. And actually we were talking to someone recently who owns a couple of horses. And they would take the horses on trails and they would come back and the horses would have these tick nests, as you're referring to, and they would be up and down the legs and they had to carefully, for the humans around them to be careful not to get the ticks on them. But, the animals like moose and horses, and we're hearing about those all the time.
Yeah, they can have thousands of ticks on them at once.
And just before we move to the next topic, I want people who are listening who are family members, partners, and friends to understand that, the person that you're listening to this podcast about, that you're making donations to Global Lyme Alliance for, if you're taking the time to listen to this or, to watch this on YouTube, thank you. And understand, it's not just one real disease that your loved one is dealing with. Your loved one is almost 100% dealing with multiple, divergent type of diseases, that are coming through on the tick.
Yeah, very complicated. You're exactly right. And it's going to take a lot of sophisticated work to be able to understand and move that person back to health. It can happen, but it's a little different for everybody. You sort of touched on that at the beginning, Fred, and we were just talking about that at a lunch yesterday, but every Lyme patient is different. So if you're sitting at a table with 5 people and you all get bit by a tick, you could have 5 very different journeys. One could have no symptoms or, require just a little bit of antibiotics because I had a headache, saw a bullseye rash, I got my antibiotics. Another person could have multiple co-infections. Someone might not have Lyme, but have like anaplasmosis and it's completely different. So wild, wild west out there when it comes to what you might get. So your best defense is an offense. You have to understand what it could be and how many different symptoms could really go back to tick-borne infection, when to trigger that request of the test, right? Because, okay, I've been a couple weeks and I've not gotten better. You may or may not find the tick, and your tick bite may or may not cause a bullseye rash because of what's in its belly. So this is all part of what you really need to understand in order to take care of your loved one. If you find a tick on somebody, don't wait for the rash, and if you can, send it away for that DNA testing, because then you'll have that blueprint, that roadmap to say, I know what was there and what I was possibly exposed to. And so now I can really look up those symptoms and pay attention. And you can go to gla.org to understand more about the in-depth symptomology of all of these different co-infections.
Yeah. All right. Tell us more. I mean, I know there's
Yeah.
another very nefarious co-infection that we want to talk about as well.
Yeah. And I think you had mentioned earlier, you might have known about Bartonella before today, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Bartonella, just a fun fact, we have indications that Bartonella goes as far back as 4,000 years ago.
Wow.
So in 1919, there was a major in the British military that uncovered Bartonella's transmission via body lice. So Bartonella, just a quick aside, they have not been able to identify Bartonella inside of a tick yet. They find it in other vectors, right? So a vector-borne disease is a disease that comes from an insect bite. So, mosquitoes, and you have bed bugs and lice and fleas, right? Those are all vectors. And when any of those guys bite you, they could transfer over a bacteria. It's just interesting because Bartonella is very, very common co-infection with tick-borne illness, but labs, like I mentioned before, Tick Report, haven't been able to find it really in the belly of a tick yet, but it's there, right? So a little bit about this, he found it in body lice. So this is during World War I, where trench fever, which is aptly called shin bone fever by soldiers, was just rampant. So among those that were infected with this were J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And so building on that original work, there was a researcher, J.W. Vinson, that was working in the United States Army in the 60s. And he's the one who identified Bartonella quintana as the agent that's responsible for trench fever. So in the 60s, they cultured the bacteria in blood and through experiments confirmed its link. So overview, Bartonella bacteria, it's a pathogen that's transmitted through these various vectors. There's a great importance for understanding about Bartonella beyond its traditional association with cat. So cat scratch disease is often what's linked with Bartonella, but there's a much bigger implication here. It's a really stealthy pathogen. So it has a very slow growth period, which gives it the ability to evade detection for a very long time. And this can cause a range of symptoms. So this is from your typical cat scratch fever, which is a fever, enlarged lymph nodes, to some more severe chronic illness that can infect multiple organ systems. There's also neuropsychiatric implications with Bartonella. So on our last podcast together, we talked a lot about neuropsychiatric disease. Yeah. Bartonella has a big, big link to neuropsychiatric disease. Yeah. So Bartonella the infection can get into your central nervous system, leading to these neuropsychiatric symptoms, and it's really challenging to diagnose because not only does it have a slow growth period, but it doesn't stay in your bloodstream for very long. So testing can become very challenging, and you can have a lot of false negatives with Bartonella. So if you think that this might be something you're exposed to, you really have to be your own advocate to continue to get testing, because we know that it's stealthy and it's hiding. And unfortunately, right now, the only good test we have is just going to be looking for it in your bloodstream. And so it's another area of research that we really just need to have, is we need to have a better diagnostic for Bartonella.
Yeah, I've met so many Lyme survivors since I published my book, Love, Hope, Lyme. And a bunch of them, when they communicate with me, they'll talk about the neuroside of the Lyme, which they believe is coming from the Bartonella. As a matter of fact, a couple of people will go right to it. They say, there's the Bart. I had another Bart attack this week. And, a lot of people talk about how it does get into the brain and your nervous system. And for people listening today, once the parasites and the bacteria, and just another point there, Lyme is a bacteria, Bartonella is a bacteria. You mentioned Babesia, which is a parasite. Yeah. So, it's two completely different invaders in the body. That's right. Of course, they're all very, I hate to say this, good at what they do, unfortunately, in getting into joints, of course, and your heart for carditis and crossing the blood-brain barrier. And when that happens, it's a very, very big challenge. But yeah, so you mentioned the Bartonella Discovery Project.
I want to talk about that, because what are we doing about it today? About 2.5 years ago, GLA started launching a fundraising campaign called the Bartonella Discovery Project. Because again, we're not talking about Bartonella out loud. I mean, we're trying to here at GLA, but the greater community might not. Some members of your podcast might say, I've not heard that before. What is that? And so we started to say, we have to be the ones that fund this. We have to be driving some research here. So we recently initiated funding for what we're calling the Bartonella Discovery Project. And our researchers through that project are seeking to understand why are current treatments often falling short to success. And the study aims to unveil these various hiding spots of bacteria within the body, including the heart, tissue in the brain. And is Bartonella inside the cells, or is it outside of the cells? Or is it in the biofilms within those tissues? So they really want to take a really deep look at where is it when it's inside the tissues and not in the bloodstream, so we can better understand and find it. Additionally, they're also going to test different antibiotic combinations just within test tubes at this point against this infection. So they're going to start saying, okay, let's combine these antibiotics and see how it does. Let's combine these antibiotics and we're going to see how that does. And so this research is being done with Dr. Monica Embers at Tulane University. And she's a big researcher. She specializes in Borrelia burgdorferi and Lyme disease. And her research program focuses on three main areas. She's evaluating antibiotic efficacy against Lyme disease, identifying treatments to eradicate Lyme disease and other infections. And she's also taking a look at, infections and looking for a cure for all of this. She's just doing such a beautiful job. Over the years, she's expanded her research to include Bartonellosis, which is what's really exciting for us. And we're really grateful to our donor base because we were able to come to her and say, yes, go do it, because we really need to get a better understanding here. And Fred, I have members of our community reaching out, those stories you had anecdotally about it's Bartonella is what's raging in me, that I know in my gut, that's what's not getting me back to health. It's holding me back. I hear that a lot too, anecdotally, especially with neuropsych conditions or symptoms. Anecdotally, they're saying, I just know it's the Bartonella. And I think those gut feelings are really important when you're paying attention to your body.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point you just made there. Is one thing we keep hearing is, it's your body, so you know what's going on. And I just want to acknowledge, some of the doctors and some of the scientists that you're working with. It really is quite remarkable. A lot of them got their start because either they or someone in their life had Lyme disease. Dr. Harwitz talks about that a lot, and Dr. Nathan and a bunch of other doctors as well, of course. But this is not. It's so complicated, as we talked about, but it's also, we hear a lot of people who still dispute, and that's one of the great reasons we talked about, Chris Maloney and Lindsay Keys and Allie Hilfiger, who were on Capitol Hill. Again, we're doing today's interview at the end of April in 2024, if you're listening in the future. And again, I interviewed Laura MacNeill in a previous episode of the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast. Go seek that one out and listen to this one as well. But there's so many implications. This is a disease with political implications. And one of the reasons why we started the Love, Hope, Lyme podcast, the reason my book is called What Family Members, Partners, and Friends Who Love a Chronic Lyme Survivor Need to Know, is because people were disputed, right? It's a disease you can't see. People were told it's in your head, because one of the challenges here, Laura, is that it's so difficult to pinpoint down exactly what is going on in your body because of these multiple infections besides the Lyme. And kudos to the scientists and the doctors that you're working with.
It's a complicated infectious disease area. You're right. There's so much controversy. And I feel, as a new member of the community, which, by the way, if you found this podcast and you don't have a direct connection, kudos to you, because you and I are in the same camp. And I want to encourage more people who don't have a direct implication yet, right, to come on in and help push. Because the truth is, that tick doesn't care who you are, how healthy you are, how often you work out. If you miss your bug spray one time, if you don't do a tick check one time, it could alter the course of your life dramatically. Not everybody, right? We say Lyme disease and all these infections are a spectrum, just kind of like COVID is a spectrum. Some people are like asymptomatic, no big deal, and other people have these life-altering symptoms that persist. Why is that happening? But that's happening in our community too, and it's been happening for a long time. And it just feels like a moment in time where this disease is going to get what it needs to just get pushed up over the hill. And we're just stuck right here on a precipice and we need to push. And your story, Fred, is so unfortunately common in this community of loved ones, families being broken apart because of the lack of understanding and the lack of a path forward for health in the medical system. So patients are just left to figure it out. And oftentimes they don't even know it's tick-borne illness because they get tucked into something else.
Yes.
You know, Lyme is the great mimic. It looks like a lot of other things. You add co-infections to that, forget about it. And so patients are often, and we know several of them, that were misdiagnosed with things like Parkinson's disease, MS, early onset dementia.
Yes.
Just to name a few, ALS is in the mix, fibromyalgia, chronic migraine, because that's the symptoms they're carrying, but that's really not what's driving it. And so oftentimes, if what's really driving it is tick-borne infection, long-term antibiotics can make them feel a whole lot better and their symptoms start to regress and they start to back up. Brain fog is so common with these co-infections when you're caught up in multiple things. You know, people cite getting lost going home from work, forgetting where they were while like in a fitting room at a department store trying on clothes. They just completely forget where they are. You can imagine that type of change in somebody's mindset and their brain chemistry and what that does to a significant other, to your children, because you're suddenly just such a different person. And it's a medical condition that's driving it.
Yeah. You know, for people here, I've spoken to people who've gotten bit in Central Park, you know, who can track back the bite in Central Park in New York City.
Oh yeah. They're there.
For people to say, oh, it's just in a remote, you know, trail in Martha's Vineyard or, you know, upstate Massachusetts or Hudson Valley, you know, ticks get on birds, birds fly. And, you know,
mice love New York City, don't they?
They definitely love. Yeah. So anyway, listen, again, we talked today with Laura MacNeill, the CEO of the Global Lyme Alliance. We're going to be talking to Laura every quarter to get an update on a lot of the research that's happening in the science world and the medical world. This has been a great show on co-infections. I've been wanting to get deeper into this for a while, so I'm glad you got us caught up. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I guess I'll ask your community, you know, you guys were so great in the last podcast to put some comments in that we are paying attention to and we're responding. If there's a specific deep dive in any one of these co-infections you want to know more about, I would encourage you to let us know because, you know, Fred and I have a really open dialogue and I'm not a researcher, right? First and foremost, I'm here to just explain that there's more here. But if you guys want a deeper dive, I think it'd be a wonderful opportunity to bring on one of our funded researchers. They can tell you a little bit more about what's going on there. And if you're interested in that, I would just encourage you to have that dialogue with us and let us know what's going on. If you want to learn more today, though, since that's going to take a little bit of time, go to gla.org, globallymealliance.org. We have write-ups, information, research papers, the researchers we're funding, where they are. All of that mapping can be found on our website. And we are also talking about these co-infections regularly and the research we're funding through our social channels on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. So if you want to follow us just to learn more or take a deep dive, either way, gla.org is a place to get started.
Yeah, you guys provide a tremendous amount of information, so I applaud you on that. And yeah, it's our YouTube show with you on the Love Hope Lyme podcast on YouTube. We had like 25 comments, which is great, you know, for a podcast like ours. And some of the questions were great questions, very deep, thoughtful. You know, one of the things too is the people who have this disease and co-infections, you know, there's no easy answers. They're complicated. As I tell people, if you've had the tick bite without it being treated for more than a couple of weeks, you know, you're definitely going to move to the chronic stage, and it's going to be something that you're going to be needing to deal with. All right. Once again, I want to thank Laura MacNeill, the CEO of Global Lyme Alliance. I want to thank everybody who listened today. My name is Fred Diamond. This is the Love Hope Lyme podcast.